For weeks, the story of the murders stayed on the front pages of the Houston newspapers. To great media fanfare, Carol's mother arrived from Colorado and announced that her son had to be innocent because he would not have buried bodies at the same boat stall he loaned out to friends of the family to store the furniture. Then the 12 grand jurors who indicted Henley and Brooks for murder issued an explosive report criticizing the police and the district attorney, saying their investigation left unexplored the possible involvement of others in related criminal activities. Some of the jurors were so outraged that they conducted their own investigations, driving around Houston, interviewing witnesses, and trying to find out where more bodies might be buried. Perhaps the only moment of sanity came during a pretrial hearing for Henley when his mother, Mary, ran across her neighbor, Dorothy Hilligus. A reporter who witnessed the scene wrote, "Each tried at a choked smile and a politely blurted hello. Formally, they addressed each other by last names. Until Mrs. Henley moved to East Texas 13 years later, she stayed in the same house on 27th Street, and whenever Mrs. Hilligus would see her at the grocery store, the two women would continue to politely say hello. My mom did her best to forgive," recalls the Hilligus' youngest son, Stanley, who now works for a Houston oil field service company. "But I'll never forget getting out early one day from high school, and I came home and found her with all the photos of all the newspaper stories spread out. She was screaming, 'Why, God, why?'" Years passed before many parents were able to clean out their sons' rooms, keeping only such souvenirs as a penmanship award or a report card with straight A's, a layaway receipt for a bicycle, or a crayon drawing of a mother's smiling face. When friends would come to visit, the parents tried to talk fondly about their sons, but they inevitably ended up saying such things as, "If only I had picked him up from school that day," or "if I hadn't said anything about him needing a haircut," or "if I'd just given him one last hug." Whenever Henley and Brooks would apply for parole, saying that he was no longer the misguided teenager he had once been, the parents were forced to relive the murders as they wrote letters to the state parole board detailing the torture their sons had endured. In 1997, they were devastated to learn that a local art gallery would be showing a collection of paintings that Henley had done in prison, ranging from landscapes to a pencil drawing of the model Kate Moss. Some parents and family members stood outside the gallery on opening night holding signs that read, "Hang Henley, not his art." Despite the protest, 21 of 23 paintings quickly sold. "I know people will always think that I'm evil," Henley says, "but I know it's not true. I know I'm not useless. I know I've become someone my mom would be proud of." For a moment he fiddles with his reading glasses. "Do you realize I hadn't even gotten my driver's license, and there I was, out committing murders with Dean just because I wanted to please him?" Nevertheless, Henley and Brooks do not have to be reminded that their murder spree continues to destroy lives. In 2008, Henley's one-time buddy, Tim Curley, who survived Correll's torture board, gave his one and only interview to a Houston television station. "I have two choices," Curley said about that night in August 1973. "Either accept it and move on, or kill myself." According to a close relative, Curley spiraled downward after the interview, drinking heavily and suffering from his own form of post-traumatic shock. In March of 2009, Curley died in South America, reportedly from a heart attack. Meanwhile, many parents of the murdered boys remain frozen in time, still unable to understand what happened to their sons. Some parents are now in nursing homes, their minds starting to slip away, which is maybe a blessing considering all that they suffered, says Deborah Agar, whose mother, Josephine, suffers from Alzheimer's disease. "Yet when I've mentioned my brother's name in front of her, she started to cry." Over in southwest Houston, the Garcia 80-year-old Louise and 77-year-old Doris continue to live in their same home with a faded photo of Homer on the wall, and on Sundays they still put on their best clothes and visit his grave, setting down fresh flowers when I started staring at the words on his marker, which read, "The day they took you, part of us went with you. And in the Heights, there is Mrs. Scott in September when her neighbor, Mrs. Hilligus, died in her home. At the age of 88, Mrs. Scott told her younger son, Jeff, who had moved back in with his mother to look after her, that she could be the last parent left in the neighborhood who had lost a son to Corll. Although she was unable to attend Mrs. Hilligus' funeral, held at the same Catholic church in the Heights where David's had been, she heard that the priest had told the mourners that despite the many good things Mrs. Hilligus had done over the years, she would always be remembered as a woman of sorrow. Mrs. Scott said to Jeff, "There are days when that's what life feels like, just sorrow." Driving past her house on their way to and from work, the new generation of residents barely notice Mrs. Scott as she stands in the front yard feeding her doves. They have no idea she is, and why would they? When Sharon Derrick rang her doorbell in October, Mrs. Scott assumed that everyone had forgotten about the murders. "I'm sorry," she said to Derrick. "You're here to talk about my Mark?" As a teenager growing up in Austin, Derrick had read as many newspaper stories as she could find about the killings, but she too had forgotten about them until 2006 when she went to work at the Harris County Institute of Forensic Science. One afternoon she walked into one of the institute's refrigeration units and saw two plastic tubs, a cardboard box, each one marked 1973 mass murders. The containers held the unidentified remains of three boys dug up from Corll's burial yard. Derrick, a scholarly, silver-haired woman, had no idea there were still bodies from the Corll killings that had never been identified. During her free time she began studying old autopsy reports. She read the original report case files of the murder investigations, and she tracked down as many of the missing persons reports as she could find that had been filed with the Houston Police Department between 1970 and 1973. She also pursued a stack of other missing persons reports, the pages yellowed by time, that had been mailed to the medical examiner's office in the 70s from parents and police departments around the country. One of Derrick's colleagues had come across the reports stashed in the back of the file cabinet. Derrick then conducted DNA tests on the unidentified remains. DNA testing was used to identify bodies in 1973, and she sent the skulls and those remains to a laboratory at Louisiana State University that specialized in computerized facialized approximations. In December 2006, she drove to the Ramsey unit to meet David Brooks. They sat across the table from each other in an office, and Derrick took a breath. Though he had agreed to meet her, she had no idea if he would cooperate. He had never spoken to anyone other than a few close friends about his role in the murders, but somehow she was able to get him to open up. Discussing his early days with Corll, he said surprisingly, "I wish I had told my mother what he was doing to me. If I had told her, I wouldn't be here now." He mentioned that the girl he had married in July 1973 had given birth to his daughter, who regularly visited him when she got older, but he told Derrick, his eyes filling with tears, she had died in a car crash on the night of her high school prom. Derrick slid a photo of one of the computerized facial approximations across the desk and asked if he knew the boy. Brooks stared at the photo and said he didn't know who the boy was, but that he knew how he had died. Then on the sheet of paper he drew a map of an intersection in the Heights, Shepherd and 13th Street, and he pointed to a particular corner where the boy had lived. Derrick realized that that was the home of a boy who had disappeared in 1971, whose frantic mother had filed a missing persons report 2 days later. After she learned that her mother had recently died, she contacted the two sisters of the missing boy. They came to Derrick's office and began to weep. "I miss Mama. I wish Mama had been able to know this," one of the sisters said. "She would have had some peace when she died." After doing DNA tests with a colleague at the Institute, she discovered that a body stored in a different area of the refrigeration unit. It had been found on High Island in 1983 and labeled as an archaeological remain, was actually another Houston boy who had been murdered by Corll, which upped the known number of his victims to 28. She then received an intrigue intriguing tip from two Houston freelance writers, Barbara Gibson and Deborah Feeney, who published their stories at TexasCrimeNews.com and are so obsessed with the killings that they've approached the owner of Carol's old storage shed to ask him if they can dig even deeper than the police did. The woman told Derek they believed that the medical examiner's office had used the wrong missing persons report in 1973 to identify the remains of Michael Balch, one of the two Balch brothers who were abducted and murdered on separate dates, and that he could very well have been misidentified. After doing more DNA tests, Derek realized they were right. Since the parents were both dead, she was forced to call the siblings of the brothers to give them the news. As stories about Derek's work appeared in the local media, more families began contacting her, and some from as far away as California and Florida. A family called from North Texas telling her that their son hitchhiking to Houston was last seen in Dallas getting into a white van. Carol had been known to make trips to Dallas. Mitzi Fitzgerald, a 39-year-old mother from the Houston suburb of Cypress, told Derek she was only a year old when her 16-year-old brother, Rodney, disappeared from English Oaks Apartments located on Gessner near Interstate 10, one of Carol's old stomping grounds. Her family had an all too familiar story. Her grieving father, she said, had gone into rages and blaming himself up until the day he died, and her mother had slipped into a depression from which she still hasn't recovered. Derek became even more driven to help these families. After reading the file on Mark Scott, she especially wanted to do what she could for Mrs. Scott. There had always been questions about what had happened to Mark's body after he was murdered. In 1973, officials with the medical examiner's office had told the Scotts that they believed Mark had been buried at High Island, but they weren't sure where his remains were. Desperate to find his son, Walter Scott had driven to High Island almost every day with a shovel so he could dig into the sand and pray for something to guide me, he later said. In 1994, more than 2 decades after the murders, the medical examiner's office presented the Scotts with remains that they say they believed were Mark's based on early versions of DNA identification. Although the family had the remains cremated and placed at the chapel of the Chimes at Brookside Memorial Park, they were still not convinced they had been given the right boy. Fortunately, the medical examiner's office had kept a single bone from the remains that had been given to the Scotts. When she visited Mrs. Scott, Derek said that because DNA technology was now so advanced, she would be able to let them know if Mark was in their chapel. All she had to do was get a DNA sample from one of them and compare it with a new sample she had taken from the bone. I think these might give you some peace of mind, Derek said to Mrs. Scott, who nodded and replied, I would like to know. Derek swabbed Jeff's cheek and returned to her office, where she sent the DNA to a laboratory at the University of North Texas to be processed. Finally, in February of this year, Derek received the results. She returned to the Scott's home and asked Mrs. Scott and Jeff to sit down. In what she would later describe as one of the saddest moments of her career, she told them that the DNA from Jeff's swab did not match the DNA that came from the bone. The conclusion was inescapable. Mark was somewhere else. Derek said that his remains were probably still at High Island. She paused and added that because the beach had been underwater since Hurricane Ike, there was a good chance Mark would never be found. Mrs. Scott said nothing. Nearly 40 years later, the grief was still so intense and so bottomless that she looked as if she could not take another breath. Then she said, if we've got someone else's son, I want his real family to have him. For a few seconds, Derek held Mrs. Scott's hand, attempting to console his mother. Jeff told her, maybe the ocean will uncover him and someone will find him floating in the water, or maybe he'll wash up to shore and we can give him a proper burial. All I'd like to know before I die is where that man put my son, Mrs. Scott later said. I want to know where my Mark has gone. She walked outside to feed her doves. I like that they come to see me, she said, throwing an extra handful of birdseed toward Mrs. Whitney. I like knowing that they need me. For a moment she started to look down the street. There was a figure in the distance, but then Mrs. Scott stopped herself and spread more birdseed around. The doves around her fluttered, then settled, then fluttered again. When all the birdseed was gone, Mrs. Scott walked back inside her house to sit on her flower-printed couch, where a photo of Mark, smiling broadly with dimples in his cheeks, sat nearby.